Hello, Rebels. Welcome to the base. Steve Hilton here. Kristen Garcia Dumont is with me. How are you doing, Kristen?
Great. Hello, everyone.
So we've got a really interesting guest today on an issue that is very much a live issue right now in California. It's become a national story as well, which is the oil spill off the Southern California coast. Lots of people talking about it, but no one as provocatively and in as fascinating a manner as our guest today. We'll get to him in a minute. First of all, make sure you follow us at Apple, Spotify, YouTube, wherever you get your podcasts. We do appreciate it. Let's bring in our guest for today, Alex Epstein. He's the founder of the Center for Industrial Progress, and he's the author of a book with a very, again, I keep using the word provocative because I think that you'll find that what he has to say is provocative. The title of his book is very provocative. The Moral Case for Fossil Fuels. Alex, great to see you. Thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for having me. I've seen a bunch of good stuff from you on Twitter over the months, and as I said before the show, I had no idea you had a British accent, but it's great to see rationality in California, where we both live.
There you are. I appreciate that very much. And as our listeners and viewers know, I still have the accent, but now I'm an American. I've got the passport. I'm official. So, very proud American too. Alex, I want you to talk. The reason that we're talking today is that you put out a thread on Twitter about this oil spill that was just so interesting because it's completely counter to the narrative that we're hearing in the media, not just here in California, but across the country, that this oil spill it's an ecological disaster. It shows that we have to kind of immediately kind of stop all oil and gas production and so on and so forth. The kind of very one-dimensional narrative that I haven't seen it challenged anywhere. Before weighing in myself, I just want you to lay out the case. Tell us your response. And first of all, if you could just start by explaining that this is something that, you've seen at firsthand based on where you are in California. Tell us the whole story.
Yeah, so I'm coming at this from an interesting perspective because I'm two things. I'm a Laguna Beach resident and very avid beach goer. So I go to my local beach, Victoria Beach, usually 2 or 3 times a day. So I'm, very obsessed with the beach and the ocean. But I'm also a big advocate of oil as a fundamental value to human life. And those don't always go together, but I think they always should go together because, as I talk about in Moral Case for Fossil Fuels, the amazing world we live in, including a world where we have the ability to live near the beach, to enjoy the beach, to have that kind of time, to make surfboards, to have boats, all the great things about our world, it's ultimately possible because we have machines doing so much work for us. And oil is a unique source of energy or machine power because it's so good for mobile machines. Oil is naturally concentrated and stored energy that's just unrivaled for so many different things. Even with the beach cleanup, you see they're using oil-powered machines to clean up an oil spill. Right. So I don't think of the beach and oil as like they're separate. I think of it as oil makes it possible for us to enjoy things like the beach. And more broadly, when I think of oil, my background is philosophy. I try to always think about the benefits and side effects of something. So when I see an oil spill, which is definitely a negative side effect of oil use or really oil misuse, like I want to look at that in context. I don't want to just say, oh, well, it had a side effect, therefore we should get rid of it. I want to look at the full context. And so I come at this one from just seeing like oil is an indispensable value. And in California, we do enormous harm to ourselves by restricting oil. We pay over $1 a gallon more for fuel than the rest of the country, actually considerably more now, which costs us $20 billion a year. To put that in perspective, the last oil spill on the scale of this one cost $20 million to clean up. So you really have to think of the full context. And then if you look at this oil spill in particular, you have to really assess its damages accurately. You can't just say, oh, it's an ecological disaster, it's the end of the world. What actually happened is there's oil that's in a place we don't want it, but oil is a natural organic substance that naturally comes out of the ocean floor in this area dozens of times more than it came out in this particular oil spill. So it doesn't mean the oil spill is a good thing, but it does mean that this is something that's manageable, that's temporary. Newport Beach has already restored swimming. Laguna Beach has closed down the whole beach, including the sand, for no good reason. So that's just pseudoscience. This is something it's a bad thing, but it's a temporary thing, and it in no way justifies these kinds of offshore drilling bans, which would just make our destructive oil restrictions even worse. So that's the perspective I'm coming with.
So let me just dive into a couple of the specifics there. I want you to explain that 12 times thing. I don't think I really understood that. So I'd love you to talk about that a bit more.
Sorry.
But another thing I just want to pull out that really kind of struck me from what you had to say on Twitter, again very provocatively, was you were saying, well, I'm just, as we've talked about on the show, I think of myself as an environmentalist, and very pro environmental protection and conservation, but very against the kind of ideologically driven kind of climate zealotry that we see from the left and the consequences of that. We may not agree about every aspect of that, but I definitely think of myself as pro-environment. And so when I see the pictures of the, sea life and birds, for example, covered in oil, and, it's a natural response. Now, well, that's terrible. We want to avoid it. You just mention the specific point you made about the birds, if you would.
Yeah. So I'll talk about the birds and then the ocean. So we have this idea, which people didn't have in California 75 years ago because they were just tar balls all over the place. And there was actually oil drilling all over the place in Southern California. People didn't mind too much, but people were aware more so, like the La Brea tar pits. You'll see certain places where people are aware, there's kind of this oily stuff that naturally seeps. And that's just a tiny indication of reality, which is that oil is constantly seeping from the bottom of the ocean. So when I'm talking about in this general area, dozens of times more oil naturally seeps out the bottom of the ocean than came out in this particular leak. Now, the issue with this particular leak is that it's more concentrated, at least for an amount of time. It's more concentrated. Eventually, a lot of it dissipates. And so you're putting a bunch of oil in a place where you don't want it. And in that concentration, it'll interfere. It'll kill certain birds. It'll coat certain things you don't want coated. It'll definitely interfere with fishing for a certain amount of time. It'll interfere with swimming for a certain amount of time. But it's not this devil substance. It's not one of the more hazardous things on Earth. It's actually one of the less hazardous things on Earth. But I believe that most people who think about environment, unfortunately, have an anti-human bias. So they think, if we created something, it must be a catastrophe, versus just putting it in context and saying, this is not good, but this is not the end of the world. And it's temporary. So it doesn't justify these crazy anti-oil measures that will just hurt everyone indefinitely. And then in terms of the birds, people who claim to be concerned about birds often will get upset if a bird is coated by oil. But when rare endangered birds are being chopped up by the normal operation of wind turbines, there's no concern. I was debating somebody on a show yesterday, and before the show, I looked at her Twitter history to see how much she had mentioned wind turbines killing birds. And she had no interest in that at all, but she claimed to be, totally distraught. Maybe that's an exaggeration, but very upset about these oil-covered birds. So there's another kind of bias there. It's the anti-human bias, but also the anti-fossil fuel bias. Any negative of fossil fuels we focus on, any negative of wind is somehow uninteresting.
But how prevalent are those side effects? Because I do think there is a very deep indoctrination of oil equals bad, right?
Mm-hmm.
You're greedy, you're a Texan, it's Republican, whatever, but it's bad. And solar and wind is perfect, and you don't have these side effects. And so the headlines really grab people's attention because they don't really know what the side effects are, if any, of solar and wind. So can you talk about that a little bit? Because I think that's a concern.
Sure. So, I'll just say the main problem with solar and wind, which I can get into if you want, is that it doesn't have the benefits of fossil fuels. So it's fundamentally unreliable energy, and wherever it's used, it doesn't replace the cost of reliable power plants. It adds to them. And then when you try to cut down on reliable power plants to make things okay, you have what happens in California and Texas. You have blackouts. So the main problem is they don't have the benefits of fossil fuels, which are fundamental to a good modern life. But the side effects are pretty significant, but they tend to be less visible, in part because they substantially occur in other countries. So bird killings are an exception to that. That's just something that's not publicized much. But Michael Schellenberger, a really good writer, has publicized, some of the most rare and valued birds are particularly targeted by wind turbines. So there's that kind of thing. But in terms of things like air pollution, if you're using a wind turbine or a solar panel, it's not going to contribute to air pollution. Whereas if you have a coal-fired power plant, it has a certain amount of air pollution, although I think much less than people think. It kind of like with an EV, you don't see any direct exhaust from it, whereas you do have exhaust from a gasoline vehicle. And all things being equal, that's better. But you do have to look at the big picture. So with solar and wind, you have enormous amounts of mining that occur. They require way more materials than fossil fuels because the sun and the wind are very dilute. So they require large amounts of land, large amounts of materials to harness. But those are often happening with quite a few human rights abuses abroad. So we don't think much about all the people who are being enlisted to produce this stuff. And in general, most of the processing is done in China. So there are a lot of side effects. They're not as visible, and sometimes they're not here as much. They are very real, and I think they're ignored because of this bias. But I will stress the main thing is that they don't have the benefits of fossil fuels. The only thing that's really cleaner than fossil fuels that can at least hypothetically in the near future have a lot of the benefits is nuclear. And interestingly, that is opposed by most of the modern green movement.
Absolutely. Well, we've Michael Schellenberg, absolutely agree. He's great. We've had great conversations with him on the show a number of times, including on the nuclear issue. Just because of your focus on this, I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about the, I guess the history of, because even before this oil spill, you had that there's a lot of discussion about offshore oil drilling here in California. Should it be banned, and who's in charge, and so on. I'd love you to just lay out what's been the story on that and where we stand, and the regulations around that. I seem to recall something the Trump administration did, battles over that. Who's in charge of all of that? But before we get to that, actually, one thing I just wanted you to address, as I've seen it, when I retweeted your thread and I was just interested in the comments, and a couple of people say, "Oh, you can't believe a word he says because he's paid by the fossil fuel industry." So I just wanted you to address that in case people are listening, thinking, "Well, who is this guy basically a lobbyist for oil?" And what should we take it seriously, or is this just is he just a mouthpiece for the industry?
Sure. So a bunch of stuff there. So remind me about the offshore policy thing if I forget.
Right.
But in terms of it, so in my view, so my personal story happens to have nothing to do with the oil industry. I was a philosopher and writer at a think tank. I was under no pressure to conclude anything about this. And on my own, not even knowing anyone in the industry, let alone being funded by them, I came to this basic conclusion of the moral case for fossil fuels. And, then I was fortunate that an agent discovered me and Penguin picked up the book and published it and it became a bestseller. And that led to a lot of things. As part of that, I have come to know, since I came to my conclusions, many people at fossil fuels companies, and they've paid me in various ways, including as a speaker. But for me, that's great because this is something that I independently concluded. And I think that industry is incredibly valuable. I think in many ways it's the most valuable industry in the world. So imagine somebody, works in healthcare and you say, oh, they're paid by the hospital industry. Well, they might think that's a good thing. So now I do, but I should just say, though, nobody ever has had and has any authorization to tell me what to do. So anything that people are paying me for, contributing, it's very explicit. Nobody has any editorial control, which is, that's a rare sort of privilege that I've gotten for myself. And this is not a privilege at all that most of the green movement has. They are very beholden to certain kinds of views. And if they don't express that party line, then they will get kicked out. So that's my view on that issue. Should I talk about offshore drilling now?
Yeah, please. And by the way, I completely agree. I mean, it's interesting how often these kinds of accusations are leveled by the left on this, whereas actually, for example, someone being funded by non-profits or teacher unions, whatever, on their side, it's perfectly fine, to take money from someone who will benefit from the cause that you're advocating. But it's only somehow on the right that's not acceptable. And as you say, I take you at your word. You come to you have that view, and I totally respect that, but I appreciate you being transparent about that. Yeah, let's talk about the offshore oil situation. I'd love to hear some background on that and where you think that might be headed. So,
the key thing with offshore or onshore is just oil is incredibly valuable, and we need to keep that context. And maybe just actually, given your accent, let me just emphasize, you look what's happening in Europe right now, and they have not sufficiently valued drillings for oil, but specifically for natural gas. And you can just see these massive energy crises where people are suffering because they didn't sufficiently value fuel. So the basic thing we have to realize is oil is a complete essential of life. And without it or with less of it, life is far worse. So then there's a question of, okay, where are you going to get it? And there are places onshore, that is on the land, where you can get it by drilling down pretty far. And that has a bunch of advantages to it, some disadvantages. And then you can get it offshore, and both of those are good ways. It's something like, I don't know the exact current numbers, but something like a sixth of our oil comes from offshore. So it's a very significant amount of American oil. And all things being equal, American oil is better. It keeps us more secure. And so that's being drilled around the country. Now, certain places that fancy themselves more environmentally friendly, rationally or not, have been restrictive of offshore drilling. And, I think it was in 68, but definitely in the 60s, Nixon there was the Santa Barbara oil spill, and that caused a lot of commotion. And that led Nixon to do a bunch of specific restrictions on offshore drilling. And since then, there have been various forces saying, no, we should stop this, we should allow this. And now the movement that's saying we shouldn't allow it at all, it's quite restricted, but we shouldn't allow it at all, is taking the fore. In my view, offshore oil drilling is really good. It has an increasingly good track record. And you very, very occasionally get these really bad situations, like a BP, almost a uniquely bad situation. And I think the relevant people have learned from that. I mean, that's a really bad situation. But even there, it's not the end of the world. Again, oil is not this devil thing.
That's the Deepwater Horizon in the Gulf of Mexico, right?
Deepwater Horizon, yeah, in 2000, in 2010. But again, it's incredibly rare. So everything has different kinds of risks. I think in terms of offshore activity, in terms of the risk, it's very much a manageable risk, and the value we get from it is crucial. In terms, by the way, people often talk about, I don't want to sully my coastline. Well, people are talking about building, wind turbines. You need some way of getting energy. And so people tend to want to put wind turbines offshore. That's an indefinite, quote, sullying of your coastline. And as I said, they're not very dense energy. So you need lots of them taking up a lot of space. So I'd say, the primary is oil is crucial. And I think drilling for it offshore is a good way of getting it. And we should be having more of that, not less.
I have a dumb question. One dumb question and maybe one fine question. The first one is, because I don't follow offshore drilling policy. One, I already thought it was illegal in California. And so then I read something about, it was, but then Trump allowed it. And so that's why we're in this situation. It's all Trump's fault, of course. And so question one is, what's the truth in there? And number two, why do you think this situation blew up so much? Because it is relatively minor. We're not talking about a Deepwater Horizon issue. So why did it become such a thing?
So it's a great. Whenever someone says they're asking a dumb question, I usually think it's going to be the hardest question to answer. And so I don't have. I'll get it after the show, but I don't have a specific documentation of what exactly California's offshore policies are. In part because I'm a Californian, but I focus mostly on national stuff. And with California, my big focus is electricity policy, because that's the thing that's most dramatically bad. Although it is worth noting, I mean, we are a huge importer of oil. That's another piece of context here. We use way more Middle East oil than the rest of the country, and in part because we've produced less and less oil in this place.
I just want to underline that from a political point of view. But they make these speeches about how we're clamping down on oil and gas in California because we're so green and climate, at the same time as increasing imports from Saudi Arabia with the regime that it's just so there's something so insane about that.
Yeah, so we're not producing it here. And, California has a really, I would view as glorious oil history. Some parts of California are literally the best explored places in the history of the world in terms of knowledge of geology. And it used to even be commonplace. I mean, even on the show Saved by the Bell, there's a show where they strike oil, and that's just considered a cool thing. So it really shows you how anti-oil we've gotten since the 80s and 90s. And yeah, what happens is we use huge amounts of oil, as does everyone, but particularly we do. I mean, we have some of the biggest, most important ports in the world in Los Angeles and Long Beach. And then we do not do much to pipe oil from the rest of the U.S. So if we're not producing it and we're not piping it, we're going to have to import it from somewhere. And often that's Saudi Arabia. So I'm just trying to remember your second question. Oh yeah. Why did this become such a big deal? Yeah. Well, I think there's just a huge, there's that expression. I think it was Rahm Emanuel, never let a good crisis go to waste. I think that's a general kind of mentality that people have today, maybe from both parties, of just, if there's something that's conspicuously negative, let me use it to advance my cause. And in some sense, there's even a rational thing there. Like if like when there's big blackouts, I really reinforce my points about reliable electricity. But the problem is you can't manipulate it. And I think that's what's being done here. So I often call it catastrophizing. They're taking something that's manageable and turning it into this total catastrophe in order to advance policies that don't make sense. The other thing I think is going on is, as Steve was indicating, there's just this huge view that oil spills is just the worst thing in the world. And I do think that comes from an anti-human bias, because again, oil spilling and seeping is a natural thing, but there's just this view of humans create something, it's bad. I call this human racism, because it's like anything the human race does to nature is bad. And I actually do think people should think of how pervasive is this in their own thinking. Because I actually think, for instance, a lot of the climate change, what I would consider hysteria, is based on this. Not that CO2 doesn't impact climate, I think it does. But the idea that it's the end of the world, I think people think it's the end of the world because humans are doing it and humans just shouldn't impact nature. And really, my fundamental challenge to all of this is I think it's good for us to impact nature. We should just do so as intelligently as possible.
Yeah, I agree with thoughtfully. What I just want to understand how much you're. I mean, you made the point that the oil is very mobile. That's something that it's such a great point that we don't think about often. And in my conversations with Michael Schellenberger, I've kind of been open about my attitude towards nuclear power, which was that when I was working back in the day in the UK government, I was very there's a lot of lobbying by the nuclear industry to make nuclear a bigger part of the mix in the UK. I was very against it on the grounds that it was not the usual grounds that you hear from environmentalists, which is all about safety and accidents and so on, but actually more from a conservative point of view, which is that the cost to the government, the taxpayer costs, particularly down the line in terms of fuel decommissioning, made it a very statist kind of energy source compared to others. But I've been really persuaded over the years, particularly by some of the the innovations you've seen in the industry, and so I've become very pro-nuclear. And I think it's ludicrous to try and take a position that you care about climate change and you want to do something about emissions if you're not for nuclear. And that's Michael Schellenberger's very strong view. I completely agree with it. How far would you go in that direction? So would you say that if we could imagine a situation where, I don't know, California could be, move in the direction of France, and, and of course, nuclear takes a long time to get in place, but let's say 30, 40 years from now, I don't know, we were like 70% nuclear for our electricity. I mean, would you be okay with that? Or do you positively want to retain fossil fuels as a large part of the energy mix? Where are you on all of that?
I mean, that would be really weird, right? To want fossil fuels as like an end in itself. So for me, it's all about just how cost effective is energy. And so cost effective, I think there are 4 dimensions. So one is it low cost? Is it reliable or on demand? So can we get it when we need it in the quantities we need it? Is it versatile? So can it power every sort of machine, including, big machines like airplanes and container ships and that kind of thing? And then is it globally scalable? Can it provide energy to billions of people in thousands of different places? So the reason why I like fossil fuels is it's the only source of energy right now that can do that. That's why it provides 80% of the world's energy. There's, I think, the strongest evidence that nuclear could come the closest to doing that. And maybe in the future, it could do all of it. I mean, I'm technically most excited about nuclear power. I mean, it's just an unbelievable technology. And one of the reasons is I mentioned how concentrated oil is, but the material in uranium or thorium or plutonium has a much higher energy concentration than oil. Plus, the way you harness it, it can't explode, which people don't know. So it has huge safety benefits because you don't have these out of control incidents that other sources have. And then it doesn't burn, but it heats and it's clean, right? There's no air pollution. There's no necessary water pollution. There's no CO2 if that's a focus of yours. So it really is this amazing thing. But to your point about, it being part of the government, I think that is an underappreciated huge problem of it, since unfortunately it emerged in an era where the government basically controlled it from the beginning. And I think for nuclear to succeed to its full potential, it needs to be decriminalized and really liberated to the point where people are able to start a nuclear reactor in their garage, where you have that kind of level of innovation. And that might terrify people, but I think if you look at the actual safety of the technology, it's totally warranted to have that kind of situation. But we are so far from that right now. I mean, nuclear in the US is declining. Around the world, it's pretty static. It could easily decline. I mean, even in France, you're getting opposition to it. Sweden has been shutting down reactors. Germany has been shutting down reactors. California is, of course, shutting down reactors, on the verge of shutting down Diablo Canyon. We already shut down San Onofre. So just the reality of it is, and I'm trying to change this reality, believe me, but the reality of it is that nuclear is becoming an increasingly insignificant source of energy, and that radical political reform is necessary. And that's part of why I'm so focused on fossil fuels, because nuclear can't replace fossil fuels in the near future. So I really don't want to restrict fossil fuels in a world where we need far more energy.
Do you think this bill, so they, again, need to the point of never let a crisis go to waste, they've already introduced legislation. You think that's going to pass? Or
who's they, Kristen?
Well, I think the House in California introduced a bill. I'm not sure.
The state legislature here.
That's right. I'm not sure who it was. But rushed to immediately introduce legislation to ban offshore drilling. And I think it even went a step further to say that, California will 100% get off of fossil fuels. Who knows what the deadline is going to be, but what's going to be the trigger to get there? There's a drumbeat to do this. Yeah.
It's just another illustration of why so many people are leaving here, which is so tragic. I mean, it's just our whole legislature, the composition of it, the way it works is it's just constantly doing these incredibly reactive, not thought through things based on the popular memes of the time or popular ideas of the time. And so I don't know. I wish I could say, no, of course, cooler heads will prevail. I mean, one interesting example of cooler heads prevailing is usually at the national level, candidates run for president and then they say they're anti-oil, but then they get in office and the smart people tell them, you cannot be anti-oil. So you have Barack Obama, he ran on the tyranny of oil in 2007. And then by the end of his administration, he's bragging about being responsible for record oil production. Biden doesn't seem as wise because he just jumped into office and instead of actually finding any alternatives to oil, he just restricted our pipeline and banned oil drilling indefinitely on federal lands. So we're really having this kind of total ignorance of oil's value. So if the national administration can have that, I mean, the Newsom administration, I wouldn't put anything past them.
Well, and a lot of this is going to come to a head, I think, just looking around. Right now, this winter with shortages, and who's going to be in the driving seat when you have shortages, when, you've got the restrictions on production here in America, similar things going on in Europe. The whole market is messed up because of the pandemic and there's not sufficient supply. All the investment in fracking, whatever, has been, everyone's put a stop to that because of the attitude, even if there's not specific restrictions, the kind of attitude of the Biden regime. And there's no way that you've got the renewable capacity up, to step in quickly to fill the gap. So you're going to have all this, I think this winter could be really bad. You're just looking at what's going
Europe,
on. Or in the UK.
For sure.
Now you've got lines at the gas stations right now. And then who's empowered by all of that? The Middle East, the dictatorships that we profess to hate, Putin, And so I just wonder whether actually this will, it'll be, that'll be a crisis that can start to make the case that we can't just kind of lurch from overnight to this kind of green renewable future. It's just not realistic.
I think so. I mean, my view of negative events is they can be used constructively, but there's no inevitability of it at all. And so I prefer taking kind of the intermediate negative events and trying to make the point versus waiting for a total catastrophe. But we could have a total catastrophe this winter in Europe and in China, actually. Mm-hmm. But you look at the U.S., like last year in California, we had, I think, what was very obviously a failure of the pro-renewables, I call them unreliables, because it's solar and wind. Right. The renewable crowd is actually usually against hydro. But those policies in California, I think, clearly failed. I mean, basically, there was not enough sun and wind at a given time, and our neighbors didn't bail us out like they usually do. We import something like a quarter of our electricity. So that was just a clear failure of this policy of let's mandate the unreliables and then then cut down on our reliable capacity and hope that the weather doesn't get too bad. It's really a hope-based policy. Same basic thing happened in Texas, but mostly the dynamics were wind. The wind failed, by the way, not because of not because the turbines were frozen. It failed before that. If people go to the website, I have a website, free website, energytalkingpoint.com. You can look up any topic that I'm mentioning and you'll see the facts and the references for all this stuff to make it easy. But what's happening in Europe now is it's not just one place in the country. It's an entire region that has banned fracking almost throughout it, that's restricting transportation, that's become precariously dependent on Russia, and that's mandated all these unreliables. And when you mandate unreliables, you become incredibly dependent on natural gas, because natural gas is the only thing that can rapidly cycle up and down to accommodate the ups and downs of the sun and the wind. So that's why natural gas is a particular crisis there. And I do think it's going to be harder and harder for people to explain away the problems. The main argument I've seen is they just say, oh, it's complex. Like there are so many complex causes, you can't boil it down to any cause. And actually, you can boil it down to one cause, which is that if the market were free and development were allowed, you would have plenty of natural gas and coal because we have all the technology in the world for producing them. We're better at ever than that. The only reason why the market isn't producing enough is restrictions on production and on transportation. It is actually very, very simple, but the people responsible want to complicate it to absolve themselves of responsibility.
I think the argument's dumber than that. I think you're giving people sort of too much credit. So, you know, one thing I bemoan in California is like, I don't know what happened to the IQ of this state, but it has dropped dramatically. And so you have people saying things like, no, it's because Kristen uses too much energy. That's why the grid's down. It's our fault. It's our dishwashers. It's our light bulbs. We've convinced the public that it's air conditioning and refrigerators. And God damn it, you're running your dishwasher at 4 p.m. when you should be waiting till 9 p.m. That's what's remarkable. And they've stopped thinking at that level. Like we've just blamed each other. So then we didn't even go to the next level of like, why is the grid, why doesn't it have sufficient energy to actually power what we know we need to power on a day-to-day basis? I'm worried people aren't even thinking that far anymore. They're just blaming their neighbor.
I'm curious with your experience, Kristen, how is it that people it's become normalized that you should be ultra worried about when you're using power? I don't think that existed even 20 years ago. And I find it to be very primitive and pitiful that, oh, when can I run my dishwasher? Like 75 years ago, we had a grid that could adjust to demand and you didn't have to worry about it. And yet now we're worried about, oh no, I better not use my dishwasher or plug in my EV. Why aren't people kind of embarrassed about this state of affairs and wondering, hey, isn't there a better way of doing it?
Okay, not only not embarrassed, they're excited that PG&E is sending notices to everybody saying, hey, we'll manage your power for you. You don't have to worry about it. Just make sure that you install one of our devices and we're going to turn off your power at times when we actually need it on the grid. And people run around thinking that that's fantastic to have the energy overlords decide when we get to actually turn on our dishwashers or turn on our air conditioning. I mean, I'm a little worried that we're far beyond even. And so I love having this discussion because people ask, what can we do? How do we make things stop? How do you stop the madness in California? And I really think it's like going and reading your Twitter feed, then going and signing up for your newsletter, getting educated, reading your book, and then saying, okay, now I need to go proselytize. I actually need to go in when I'm standing in carpool line, say, guys, we're going to have a brownout and that's not normal. We should be saying,
yeah, that's not normal. That's important.
That's not normal. And we need to reject it and start asking, why don't we have a reliable energy grid? People need to get educated and speak up or it's not going to stop. Sorry to rant, but I just think it's crazy.
And I can't more. Every time they do, the last few months we've had a few of these days where, you turn on the radio in the morning and they say, please save power between 4 and 9 p.m. And what is this?
Exactly.
What are you talking about? It's so embarrassing that we can't get this right. And I think one of the things that I find really, there's just, as exactly as you say, Kristen, and for both of you, the facts are just so important here. And the fact that because of the policy measures that are making us more dependent on these energy sources that are less dependable, we're importing oil from Saudi Arabia. If people even knew that, I find that just as one fact, to throw at people, is they just can't believe it. They don't know that we're even doing that. We're restricting production here in California.
I'm going to get the exact number and send it to you after the show.
It's so
very large.
Right. It's unbelievable.
Percentages. And by the way, one point about this issue Kristen raised, I find particularly effective, is to not just talk about the consumer experience, but to talk about what does it mean for industry when their power gets cut off between 4 and 9.
Yes.
How many industries are going to want to work in California versus China? I can guarantee you most of the time China's coal plants are not cutting off these crucial industrial facilities, although interestingly they have been recently to meet their climate targets. But that's probably going to stop soon because they're more concerned about economic growth than meeting these targets. But yeah, California is just another way in which we are a bad place to do business, to have unreliable power for industry. That having reliable power, low cost power, is totally life and death to their existence.
Such a good point, Alex, when you said, why are we normalizing turning off our dishwasher? It's such a great point because I had totally normalized it. Like not 8 o'clock. It's not 8 o'clock. Everybody be careful. Oh yeah, because it just gets so indoctrinated. Even everybody knows I have teenagers.
I can't believe you're falling for this, Kristen.
Well, sometimes I got to fall for a little bit so I can stay awake on all the other key moments to the fight. But it's a nice reminder of, you just hear it so often that it really just sinks in of, oh gosh, is it 8 o'clock? Oh, I got to be careful. And it becomes normalized before you realize it. And it takes a conversation like this to go, wait a minute, I got to get pissed off and fight about this too, because this is outrageous. I mean, we've become Venezuela and we're like begging to be more like Venezuela. And that's remarkable.
Yeah, it's a really interesting conversation. I'm so glad that you're able to join us today, Alex, because the energy is such a foundational thing to everything, and I just don't think we talk about it enough. So you talk about some aspects of it, and actually you don't even talk about energy. It's climate now. It's all just climate. They don't even talk about climate change anymore. It's climate. Our climate goals, and it's just such an ideology, a religion, and it's never discussed in terms of the fundamental role that energy has in absolutely everything. And I just think that I have a feeling that this, you've got this, they've got this massive summit coming up in Glasgow. That's going to be sort of, I was just I was just looking ahead at that and asking my team on my Fox News show, when is this coming up and when should we be doing something about it and so on, talking about it, which day is it? It's not a day. It's basically 2 weeks. 2 weeks.
But the beginning is the most consequential part. So I think it starts the night of October 31st or maybe November 1st. But in my view, that's a genocidal event right there.
What does that mean? Tell me why. Because they're advocating. So, we think if somebody said, hey, let's get rid of, 80 or 90% of the food in the world, people would just be like, oh, that's a really bad idea, right? That's going to kill a bunch of people. But energy is machine food. Fossil fuels provide 80% of the world's energy. And all of these conferences are trying to get to zero fossil fuel use in less than 30 years. And as I've talked about, there are no viable replacements in that time frame.
With no nuclear. They're anti-nuclear.
Yeah, with no nuclear. Exactly. I mean, even with nuclear, if you tried to totally get off fossil fuels in 30 years, even with nuclear, it would be a humanitarian catastrophe. But without it, it's just complete mass murder. I mean, I can't even say how many people, billions of people would for sure die prematurely. You just think of even agriculture for 8 billion people. It totally depends on fossil fueled machines, fossil fueled harvesters that can do 700 times the work of a manual laborer. You start making that expensive or unavailable. You talk about fertilizer, which comes from natural gas. Like the whole world modern world of 8 billion people depends on fossil fueled machines. And these people are saying, hey, let's get rid of this with no clear idea whatsoever of what will replace it, and with hostility toward nuclear, and with hostility toward hydro. And even on top of that, you might have seen they're actually preventing solar panels, wind turbines, and transmission lines from being built. Because the whole green movement that says it's bad to impact the atmosphere with CO2, impact the world with radiation from nuclear, it's bad to impact rivers with hydro. They're saying, hey, it's bad to impact the land with solar panels and wind turbines and transmission lines. So the green movement, I really want to reinforce, is an anti-human impact movement. It's opposed to all human impact, which means ultimately it's opposed to all energy, which means ultimately it's opposed to all life. And that's really what's guiding this. I don't know if this is on energytalkingpoints.com, but I'll put it there soon. Or you can search Alex Epstein IPCC, because that's the climate organization. I have a pretty damning expose of them that I wrote recently on Twitter, and I view it as a primarily political and religious organization. So I think their key basic primitive religion is eliminating human impact on Earth. And I think climate is just an excuse for that. And it's evidenced by the fact, again, they're anti-nuclear, anti-hydro, and anti-solar and wind in practice. So that's why I say it's a genocidal movement. I know you laugh at it because you didn't understand the context, but I mean that very literally.
It's a great headline. The Green Movement is pro-genocide.
It's amazing. Well, look, I think that it's interesting because, like I said right at the start of the conversation, you know, I think of myself as an environmentalist. I really care about making sure we protect open spaces and wilderness, and especially here in California, that's a huge part of what's wonderful about living here. And as you mentioned, the beaches, you know, like we all care about that, but maybe we don't all care about it. I certainly do.
So I don't consider myself an environmentalist, interestingly.
Yeah, no, I do.
Consider myself a humanist who loves a good environment.
Yes, interesting. Good way of putting it.
So here's a quick distinction.
It's actually so interesting. We're going to have to stop, Alex. I'm so sorry. But we're going to continue the conversation. But I just want to. I wrote a book a few years ago called More Human, and the thesis of the book was that, and the subtitle was Designing a World Where People Come First. And the idea of it was that, or the kind of the argument was that in many aspects of our lives, we've made the world less inhuman. We've designed things that are distant from the world, become too big and bureaucratic and centralized, whether that's, you know, the way we run schools or food or government or whatever, you know, all these different areas. It's become too far detached from the human scale. And we need to kind of make things decentralize power, make things more local, more human. And then the last chapter was called Nature. And actually, I explicitly said, well, actually, this is an area where we need to be less human because we need to think more about our impact. So we probably disagree about that. But I'd love you to maybe take a look at that, and we can have a further conversation about it. I want to just end by, can we go back to the beach and go back to where we started and this oil spill, which, as you say, people are using to sort of say, right, that's the end of it. We've got to shut down all oil and gas in California. You say the beach is open now in part of
some
the
of them.
area that's affected.
Some of them are improperly closed, like my beach. There's no reason for that to be closed.
But just kind of underline the point again, really, that and leave us with that you know how this oil spill that we've just seen sort of stacks up against other natural disasters or human-made disasters, and just how we should really see it in context.
Yes, so I just say with anything, we need to look carefully at the benefits and the side effects. Sorry if you can hear a noise in the background. We need to look at the benefits and the side effects. And here, the benefits of oil are totally fundamental to everything we enjoy in life, including the beach. And the side effect here is unfortunate, and it's probably preventable so we can make better policies in the future. But this is a temporary negative impact that's already being resolved. And it's no reason whatsoever to ruin people's lives through even more anti-oil policies. I mentioned anti-oil policies just with motor fuel cost us $20 billion a year compared to $20 million to clean up an oil spill of this size. We just really need to think of the full context. And that's the message I want to reinforce to people.
Well, there you are, Alex.
Wonderful.
Thank you so much. Really, what a fascinating conversation. Really appreciate your time today.
Thank you.
Okay, that was absolutely fascinating. Make sure that you continue following us, guys. Like and subscribe. You got to help us get the message out. Help us change California. We can do that together. So wherever you get your podcasts, listen up and subscribe. Thank you.